All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And we got a special episode for you today. A very special guest talking to Tim Reardon, who's the chief economist at the HIA. And he tells us how to fix supply. And it's got something to do with pushing water uphill. What else do we cover, Ben?
And Bryce, in the last part of the show and what's making property news, I've got a real beef with the federal Liberal Party at the moment. So I'm coming after them in what's making property news later in the show.
Duck for cover, Liberal Party. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and welcome back to you too, mate. How are you?
Mate, I'm well. I've been out and about. I've been overseas. I've come back. I've watched a good game of footy on Saturday night. I didn't think it was going to be a good game of footy, but it turned out to be a cracker.
It was a ripper. I saw that one too. But whoa. You've been overseas, mate. Rumour has it that you fist pumped the founder of Google whilst you're in America. Is that true or false?
That is a true story. Yes, I've been to a conference in Los Angeles where I got to mingle with some of the tech leaders of this world and, got to meet a few sort of big names.
Downplaying it a little bit there. You're in the room with Elon. You're in the room with Sergey and fist pumped him. You're in the room with JD Vance.
Well, I'm not sure that. Yes.
You're in the room with some serious people with, first of all, swagger, but also political influence, I would have thought.
Yeah, there were a few billionaires roaming the building and people who have done some amazing things and changed the world in so many different ways. And that's what I said to Sergey Brin when I fist bumped him. I said, thanks for changing the world. And obviously there's a podcast that I listen to that has a lot of, sort of great intellectual horsepower, sort of talking about where the world's heading and from a AI and technology and innovation point of view. And that sort of stuff really fascinates me. So that's the sort of, it's what we're sort of part of the more platform that we're building and all of these changes that are going on in conversational AI and AI in general. So I went over there to sort of get a little bit more understanding in terms of what's happening so we can implement all of those new ways of technology into the more platform.
Nice. And mate, as we're in the shadows of Mindset Minute, what was the biggest change in sort of thinking or paradigm shift that you picked up being in the room with these people who are enormously big thinkers?
Oh, I mean, God, there's so many. But there is this really interesting concept that's going on around turning atoms into bits or bytes, right? Which is this whole concept of everything being digitized. And then what sort of economic value do you capture as part of that digitization? That is fascinating. And then you start to think about, just how productive the economies will get around the world and just sort of what's happening. But there's definitely in that sort of space, they do think about the value capture in the capital side, not so much in the income side. So that's also a big play. One of the other interesting takeaways, which Chamath grabbed quickly, but I also was had an aha moment as well, was when the co-CEO of the Waymo, which is the driverless cars. Yeah. So when you're in LA, you're seeing these cars driving around. Now, they are being driven by people at a remote location, but you can obviously, hire them, jump in, and there's no driver in the seat. And the car's just driving around, taking you from point A to point B. So the autonomous driving vehicle story. And the big aha moment there was when she said, we're building one driver. And that sort of, when you start to think about that, that's exactly what they're doing. And they're getting all this enormous amount of data. They're ingesting it into their learning to build the best single driver in the world. Mm. And that is just such a powerful illustration in terms of just basically, what this means in terms of, and we know that there's, hundreds of thousands of deaths on the road that are preventable from bad driver habits and those types of things. So it's really clear to me that that these things are going to, sort of change the world over the next couple of decades. And so I take an interest in it.
Very nice. Welcome back and there were four, Ben, and then there were four. You talked about the game on Saturday night being a ripper, but
Yes.
then there were four. So let's make our predictions from this far out as we look into prelim. Who's going to take it out for you and why?
Well, I was having a chat to my father, who was originally a Collingwood supporter, but when they sacked Tommy Hafey, he went across to the Fitzroy, now the Lions, right? So, and so I'm not going to support my father because, you've got to have a little bit of, haggle between, father and son. So I'm actually going to go for Sydney. And the reason why I'm going to go for Sydney is because Brodie Holland and also you've also got the likes Brodie Holland. Did I just say Brodie Holland?
You did say Brodie Holland, but you mean the ruckman Brodie
Grundy.
Grundy, yes, yeah. Brodie Holland, good Freo sort of player who went over.
Brodie Holland, yeah, his son plays in my son's footy team. Brodie Grundy and also Tay Adams, both Collingwood lads. So I'd like to see them get some silverware. So there's the reason. So I've just
for that reason I don't want Sydney to win. So let's go for Geelong. I'll call it Geelong.
Yeah, well, of course you've got to go local. But apologies to Brodie Grundy. I've actually had.
Yeah. You've had him in the office.
Apologies, Broads, if you're listening, mate. That was a bit of it. Mate, I'm just going to put that down to jet lag.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a long bow. Brodie, I just reckon he forgot you, mate. So, hey, just a quick summer series shout out, thepropertycouch.com.au /my story. Folks, we are well and truly starting to collate ideas and opportunities that people are writing their details in. So it's not too late. Make sure you leave your details. We would love to hear from you. All right, Ben, did you know that there's an awards for podcasts?
What, here in Australia?
Here in Australia, mate. It's called the Podcast Awards. And so what do you reckon? Should we have a go?
I reckon we should. So it's a bit like the Logies, is it? Where you get, so you're going to hear us basically say, vote for us, for the Gold Logie or the most popular show. Yeah, give it a go. Why not?
Why not? So it's going to be Ben for Gold Logie here, but
no. The Property Couch. Let's go for the Property Couch. So how does it work? What do we have to do?
I have been nominated for a Logie, Ben, way back when, and location. But we didn't make it to the final round. But I don't need to tour. We should leave that as a footnote. But
that's good.
So yeah, we're going to ask anyone who's been listening to our podcast for some time if they want to help us with the vote. So if you go to thepropertycouch.com.au /vote. And if we've given you value over the time, we'd love for you to help us out there just to see if we can see how we sort of compare with our peers, Ben. And hopefully, we've been doing it for 10 years. So there's some winners in the last couple of years who've been doing a lot less time than us, Ben. So let's see how we go.
Yeah, well, that's right. We've got longevity. So if longevity means anything, we should get a vote. But I think, obviously the reason why we do this is because it allows, we don't advertise the show. We don't take advertising dollars. Like a lot of these other podcasts are run by big media companies or media companies, and that's how they get their audiences. We're not that. So, but we're here about changing people's lives through money management and good execution on buying investment property. So if it allows us to then get to new audiences, then that's helpful for us because it means that we're, basically fulfilling our mission and our purpose. So from that point of view, if you can vote for us, that just hopefully gets us into the finalist category, which then means, new people will learn about us and hear about us and hopefully manage their money better, trap their surplus and put that money to work for them.
So if you're listening to us now, folks, will you vote for us? thepropertycouch.com.au /vote.
And Bryce, before you move to your Mindset Minute, I also just wanted to highlight that Evan and I, we're going to change it up a little bit for our RBA and economic update. We're going to do a live announcement. Yeah. So live announcement. So next Tuesday at 2:30. Well, actually, I think you can join us at around 2:00. We're going to do a little bit of a lead in. So we're going to sort of talk to each other about what we think is happening out there. So it'll be about either 2:15 or 2:00 start. We're sort of still working that out. But just think about that. And then we'll lead into the 2:30. We'll hit the refresh button. We'll get the announcement up there, and then we'll talk to, obviously, some of the data that's supporting that particular story. So there will be a live episode. It'll be on Facebook. I believe it's also going to be on YouTube as well. So haven't tried it before. We've got Evan, Lucas, and myself doing that for the very first time next Tuesday, Bryce.
I reckon people should tune in for that, mate, just to hear you two riffing it beforehand, like the just the preamble before the big announcement. So,
Well, we
but,
might
you
put
know,
our predictions out there in terms of hold
yeah,
or a cut or
yeah,
increase, and we'll put our justifications in there. And as you know, for those people who listen, we do a little bit of the international news. So we'll probably get a bit of the international news away first, and then that'll lead us into obviously the rate decision here, and then why that's been made in terms of the supporting data that's helped with their obviously decision for this boardroom meeting.
very exciting, folks. Check that out. Vote for us and check out Ben and Evan live. We'd love your help. Hey, my mindset minute today is I saw this meme, right? So it's it's an interesting perspective, and I just want people to understand the context here. But let's assume the median age for death is 74, right?
Okay.
That means middle age is actually 37, right? So, whoops. Here I am still struggling to think that I'm middle aged, Ben, at 49, but there we go. But when you adjust for the perception of time, one year for a 40-year-old is 2.5% of their life, and 1 year for a 5-year-old is 20% of their life.
Yeah.
That means for a 40-year-old, it goes 8 times faster than a 5-year-old. So that means that your midpoint is more like 21, right? So you don't have as much time as you think. So the point here is make your move, take your shot, right? And then, Ben, what happened is I went into the comments section of this meme because I thought it was a really good sort of pattern interrupt and really
Very, very good.
Then I went into the comments and everyone, like, there was a ton of them, and everyone's like, "Oh, your sense of statistics is off," and you're just really slating like the detail of that. And I'm thinking, folks,
You're missing the point.
you're missing the point here. The point is this: what are you waiting for? Take the shot, ask the girl, buy the property, make the move, do whatever it is that you want to do, because we don't have as much time left as we think we do, Ben. And as I'm in the shadow of the big 5-0 for the first time in my life, I've actually started to think about that. So it's really, really important reflection. So for those of you listening that are still in your 20s, hey, you still got a little bit of luxury on your time. Make the move, take the shot. For the rest of us who might be a little bit more older than that, Ben, i.e. you and me in our vintage, the big question on Mindset Minute today is, what are you waiting for?
Love it.
Love
it, Bryce.
Make the move. All right, folks, we've got a very special guest today. We are going to talk about a topic that I think that everyone is going to be fascinated by, Ben, because it talks to the very heart of how do we actually get more supply into the marketplace, and what is the restraint in doing it. We've got a wonderful guest. His name is Tim Reardon. Let's cut to the interview you and I recently had with Tim. All right, Ben, we've got a very special guest today. We are chatting with Tim Reardon. He is the Chief Economist at the Housing Industry Association, an organisation that's been representing the Australian residential building industry for over 75 years. Tim leads the HIA's economic research and forecasting team, providing insights and analysis on the trends shaping the residential construction sector. His work is informed by feedback from builders, tradies, manufacturers and suppliers across Australia, ensuring that the HIA's economic outlook is grounded in real-world industry knowledge. Their vision is to unite the industry, advocate for meaningful change and deliver cost-effective services while maintaining high standards through self-regulation. Tim plays a critical role in this mission, using his expertise to help navigate the challenges and opportunities within the housing market. Welcome to the Property Couch, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Hey, Tim, we're curious. When we look at the housing market right now, it feels like a perfect storm of rising costs, constrained supply, and policy roadblocks. But from your perspective, what's the one factor that's being overlooked in this conversation, and how do you see it shaping the future of housing in Australia?
The one factor that probably hasn't had its due attention is the restrictions we have on foreign investors. It is one topic that we continue to pursue. What we saw in that 2015-16 cycle, when ASIC intervened into the market, they said we're building too many homes in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, particularly apartments. They put in place a series of restrictions. Then state governments doubled down. Then the federal government came in, and just in this last budget, we saw both Queensland and New South Wales introduce additional restrictions on foreign investors. Now, those measures quite possibly revenue negative. That is, they're forcing out so much investment, so much home building activity, they're going to constrain other forms of taxation, income tax, broader stamp duty, not just the punitive restrictions. So to me, it is the easy win. Just why we don't want Japanese or the Americans to build apartments in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane is beyond me.
Tim, can I just pick up on that point? For our listeners' benefit, what they need to understand is usually a developer needs a percentage of pre-sale in terms of the numbers of of properties that they need pre-sold to get the funding to actually get the construction out of the ground. Can you just unpack that a little bit more for our community to understand the importance of that? And if they don't have that level of pre-sale, ultimately we don't get, that additional 75% of supply arriving to meet this housing crisis that we've currently got.
That's right. We're building half the number of apartments now as to what we were in 2015, 2016 timeframe. And part of that is that loss of foreign investors. And at the moment, there are some other problems in the cycle as well. We've seen a rapid increase in material prices, the magnitude of about 35% since the start of the pandemic. Seen labour costs increase that 30 to 35%. We're through both of those cycles now. Material price rises through to June this year were 1.1%. So that's back to well under CPI, back to pre-pandemic volumes. Labour shortages still remain, and they're going to continue. They're not quite as acute as what they were at the peak of the pandemic. Those labour shortages will linger because of other construction activities. So in Sydney, it's Western Sydney Airport, the metro system. In Melbourne, all of the infrastructure there. In Perth, they're also building tunnels. So those labour constraints will remain. But we have a problem that we can't get anywhere near the volume of apartments commencing construction is what we need to meet underlying demand, and even not back to the level we were doing a decade ago. And that's partly due to that loss of foreign investment. Developers of apartments need, at the moment, probably 80 to 90% pre-sold before they'll get a commencement. We've entered a little bit of an infinite loop cycle where over the past 3 years, every time they sold that volume, they go back to the builder and say, yes, we're ready to start. And the builder would say, the complex is now 10% more expensive. Now we're through that cycle. We're probably still going to wait another 12 months before apartment builders have the confidence to know that they can reach completion within 3 years. High-rises are typically a 3-year build. And because of that long build time frame, they have been resistant through this cycle to commence. The second reason they're resistant to commence is there is an enormous amount of other construction projects that they can undertake at the moment where there is one customer, namely government, and they don't have to deal with the complexities of hundreds of homeowners and the like. So that is going to be a problem. There is only one way we can get to that 1.2 million, and that involves a significant increase in apartment construction. Yeah. And it is politically unpopular, but while we have 550,000 new net overseas migrants, and that number is likely to remain very elevated for at least the next 2 years. It's very hard for the government to slow down overseas migration once it's started. And migrants typically reside in apartments in metropolitan cities for the first 1 to 7 years of their time in Australia, and only then do we start to see them flow through to detached housing demand. So from a policy perspective, we have to address that apartment cycle, and at the same time continue to build medium and low-rise housing as well.
Well, we've got a fair bit to unpack there, Ben. But before we do, we're just going to take a breather and just get to know Tim just a little bit. But Tim, we like to talk to our guests about what things were like when they were growing up. So when you were having conversations with your parents over the dinner table when you were growing up, were they talking about money to you?
Oh, absolutely. So I grew up in a small sheep farm near Goulburn. I've got a little theory that there is a very high proportion of economists that grew up on farms, particularly sugar farmers from North Queensland. I think there's a high proportion of those. And in part, it comes about from, sitting down and listening to conversations on the radio about the exchange rate and how that was going to impact on wool prices and sheep exports and the like. So, yes, it is. Would also say my grandfather was a little bit politically active as well. And so the politics economics is something that I have grown up.
Isn't that interesting, right? Because it's a good point that you raise. When I was growing up, I didn't have to have the security of the income for my parents being dependent on the weather or seasons or whatever. But the point that you raised there is really relevant, isn't it? So did your parents sort of sit you down and talk, or was it just because it was so consuming that the farm life it was just too hard to ignore?
It was an all-consuming dynamic. My father is one of 6 boys, all of whom have farms. My mother's family are also, they had Snowy Mountain runs here around Canberra as well. So it was all-consuming in that sense. I think what's interesting, my daughter, coming through from a very different perspective, has now also chosen to go and study economics, which, given she's rejected every bit of her father being on television talking about the economy, for her to cycle back now and to be asking me those questions. In fact, we had a funny discussion. She was writing an assignment, and I said, this is the argument. And she said, I need a source. I go, I am your source. Here it is. Here it is on a website. You can quote me. It's fine.
Yeah. Tim, let's talk about money management then in terms of someone growing up. Now, I'm assuming that you would have worked on the farm. It's all part of the process of doing that. Did you get any part-time jobs, or when you decided to obviously move and do university study, how did you start to then organise your finances and manage money? Did you, were you a spender, or did you understand the power of, spend less than you earn and delay gratification?
Yeah, look, I certainly came from that ladder. My first roles were working as a rouseabout insuring sheds, being a farmhand. And can I say I hated every day of it? And I always wondered whether, if I ever got a job in an office, would I hate it as much as I hate this? And the answer is no. I thoroughly enjoy my job at the moment. It is one of the easiest jobs I've ever had. I travel around the country talking to builders and talking about the economy and just tell stories. So I went to uni then, quite keen to get out of that farm cycle. And I have a mate who says he's never seen anybody work so hard not to inherit a farm. That's what I've successfully done. And I went to uni, and then just followed on from there in terms of my career and working for industry associations around Canberra for 25 years.
And any brothers or sisters that grew up with you?
Yeah, 2 older sisters, both nurses here in Canberra.
Okay, and do they have the same sort of spending, sort of hygiene and sort of money management skills of you, or are these sort of?
Yeah, so they certainly do. And that flows through. I had a conversation with my nieces and nephews about superannuation, investment, and buying homes. That's an active conversation now that they're all in their 20s and partnering up. From my own personal perspective, I also married somebody that holds a very similar financial views. Kind of very different background. Her family arrived in Australia mostly in the 80s as refugees, and they hold that value of land and home and family. Just as a little aside, I do also own a little craft gin distillery here in Canberra, and its slogan is "with a sense of place and purpose." And it is something that our daughter, when she was about 13, 14, wanted to go and see all of my family history, go back and trace back a couple of hundred years, all in the same location here around Canberra on both my mother and father's side of the family. And so with a sense of place and purpose, we all need that sense of belonging, and it is particularly important in grounding kids. From a financial perspective, land is central to my family's story. I'm not sure that any other family has sued each other as frequently as my family have over land, and they're still actively doing it. But I'm out of that side of the family business.
That's what happens when there's multiple generations and not enough land to go around, isn't it?
It's difficult when it's handed down. Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, Tim, just to round out this discussion, what you mentioned your daughter has conversations with you, and she won't quote you in terms of the papers that you write. What sort of money discussions have you imparted onto your kids? Is it an open dialogue, or is it something that they're finding their independence around?
No, it's very much an open dialogue. We had a conversation about 12 months ago where she learned that we have joint bank accounts. In fact, well before I got married, I handed over all financial responsibility to my wife, who's maintained I hadn't paid an invoice for 25 years. And she couldn't comprehend, how I could do that. But yeah, we've certainly talked through, it's our money, it's not mine. My wife also gainfully employed. And I think, you sign up for that partnership money as a part of that as well.
Yeah, interesting. Hey, look, you sit at a peak position in where you are with the HIA, but it didn't start that way. Give us an idea of what the pathway to where you are now look like. So you farming, went to uni. What was the first role, and where did the spark go towards the lane that you pursued?
Yeah, I had a little bit of a sliding doors moment in the late 90s. When I left uni, I had an opportunity to go into a very large global insurance firm, or to join a little organisation called the New South Wales Farmers Association. And out of personal interest there, I chose the lesser paid one that I had a connection to, and started there in the late 90s as a research economist. Photo of myself just here on the wall. And from there, I continued through industry associations. That was prior to the introduction of the GST, and I came to Canberra during that cycle, representing small businesses here in Canberra through the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Joined HA in 2003, looking after government relations. Went to Tasmania for a couple of years, ran our operations there. One of the more interesting ones in 5 years working for the vehicle manufacturers here in Australia, which was just a deeply fascinating insight into what is a really large global business. You have Ford, Toyota, Holden, and seeing, one, how they do government relations on a global scale, realizing just how consistent it is, whether it's Uzbekistan or Nagoya, Detroit or Canberra. It is the same in every jurisdiction. It is a personal relationship. It is he with the best data wins the argument. It is all of those dynamics that you would imagine are identical in every market. So I came back to HIA, ran some other industry associations, heavily involved in climate change for a while, and now 2018 came back to HIA as chief economist, and 8 years now telling stories to builders.
Now, Tim, let's build on that story then. We saw that, the winter update through the HIA was released. It's an excellent paper. Anyone who's really, involved in this game, it's a must read for all of us. But there was certainly a really interesting section or introduction to that, which was the How to Make Water Flow Uphill, a guide for politicians. And you unpack, and this is the storytelling that we want you to share with our community, unpack that story about the frustrations that you're experiencing and the challenges and the problems that you see in some of the decisions that are being made, and what are the unintended and intended consequences of those decisions.
Yeah, so first of all, just to separate the cyclical and the structural, because the home building activity at the moment is low because interest rates rose. It's a very uninteresting story. The day it started, you know what happens. Home building slows down. People tighten their finances. That's not the interesting story. The interesting story is what's happened over the course of the past 20 years. And when governments ask, why aren't we building enough homes? What's changed? And it is, in this case, 25 years of continuous constraints. And yes, that story of who pays to make water flow uphill is a critical determinant of how many homes we build. And to do it anecdotal, if we go back to the 1970s, there was a Department of Main Works or a similar public infrastructure agency that built all of the infrastructure for new greenfields. So I'm just going to do greenfields as a easier metaphor than brownfields, but built all the infrastructure, and those buying a block of land didn't pay for the cost of that infrastructure. It was paid through consolidated revenue or through other ongoing user charges for water, electricity, road user charges, and others. In the 1990s, we started to switch to a user pays system. And then in its worst case scenario, which is in New South Wales, not only was then 100% cost recovery from about the year 2000 onwards, New South Wales then added in developer charges, developer fees, and we've seen that then proliferate in other jurisdictions as well. So a new home buyer has to pay for 100% of the cost of the infrastructure for their home and then gets taxed on that as well. And then they kept going. Now they also have to pay upfront for the cost of the infrastructure for other users downstream from them. And then they get taxed on that as well. And then they added in the cost of building parks, roads, services, and in maintaining those parks and roads and services in perpetuity, and charging those fees upfront and putting taxes on top of those, including stamp duty and GST. And so that question of who pays to make water flow uphill, because at some stage you either have to make sewage flow uphill to get to a treatment plant, or you need potable water to flow uphill for services. If we can answer that question, and if you genuinely think it is equitable to make someone building a new home, then they're just 200,000 households out of 11 million households, pay for the provision of public goods and public infrastructure, and sometimes for the provision of public housing that is for the public good upfront and tax them on that. That inequity is how we've arrived at the inequity whereby we have an acute shortage of rental stock, rapid increases in house prices, which lead to all of the poor economic outcomes. And consequently, we're going to see, unless they can increase that supply of housing, we end up with poor government policies as a result. Just coming to work this morning, listening to a politician talk about mandating what investors should be providing to a tenant, have to provide heating and cooling and so forth, and also talking about capping rents simultaneously. It is in these cycles where we get bad public policy outcomes unless we can solve that question. And it is moving those costs back to consolidated revenue. And we saw the South Australian government just a couple of months ago make a really smart policy decision whereby they are going to, for new development lots in greenfields, they are sharing the equity across consolidated revenue for a third of it, the developer on a third, and water users for the other third. And that shared equity arrangement, shared cost burden, is a very effective mechanism at freeing up both capital infrastructure and land in order to improve the supply. Detached is an important component, not the only component, as I mentioned before. Apartments are the other component. But if we can solve the greenfields problem, then we can go a long way to solving the brownfields problem as well.
Wow, there's so much in there. Let's see if we can rewind a little bit on that stuff, because it is so incredibly critical what you've just talked about, Tim,
Yeah.
because the poor old property investors getting largely the blame for why there's a housing affordability issue. But what you're saying is, can we rewind a little bit back to, you talked about the 70s and the 80s. It's just these little incremental decisions that get made that we look back in the rear vision mirror and go, that's something we shouldn't have done. But you talked to the South Australian example just then, but how do we unwind some of those incremental steps in the other states to mirror what South Australia is doing? Because everyone would be addicted to the amount of taxes that they're collecting, and to unwind that, even incrementally, would be taking some time and probably some votes.
Yeah, so we'll first do no harm, and that's particularly targeted at the moment for Victoria, where the introduction of land taxes on secondary properties and the introduction of short-term rental accommodation, that it's very nice to think that taking Airbnb and putting it onto the long-term market is going to do anything to adjust supply and demand, but of course it doesn't. So yes, we have to stop governments trying to tax their way through this. If you put a tax on carbon, you will get less carbon. If you put a tax on homes in any way, you're going to reduce the supply of homes. So that's the first focus. On the second focus, there were the longer term issue of how we get them off their addiction to taxing homes. That long-term tax reform process is warranted, and immediately people go to the GST and stamp duty, and that is a very important component. It is going to take, I think that we're more likely to achieve reform of the Senate than we are to see reform of the GST in that light. And so yes, unpicking those smaller tax imposts, the developer charges, the developer fees, the additional surcharges on foreign investors, all of those individual components, if we can continue to chip away at those without adding new ones, and of course, it's negative year-end capital gains tax will cycle back around eventually, and preventing an increase in tax on any cohort is important, as well as moving towards that goal of reducing the existing imposts.
Tim, you mentioned before we went to air, what's a house and land package worth in the metro area of Sydney, and the outer greenfield areas of Sydney today?
Yeah, typical volume builder doing a house and land package at the moment, you're looking at about 1.5 million Western Sydney, which is extraordinary. And I will add that is around 600,000 higher than what it was prior to the pandemic. Now, some of that is a rise in labour, some of it's a rise in materials, but a very large share of it is a rise in land prices. When we look at Melbourne, we're looking at Melbourne house and land package about 950, Brisbane 850, Perth 750 at the moment. They're increasing very quickly. Now, the cost of labour and the cost of materials, cost of building is very consistent around the country. Hobart, they're using polystyrene because they're building on slopes. There's half as much concrete in a house in Perth as to what there is in Sydney. But when you adjust for all of those things, the actual cost of construction is fairly consistent. The difference is land prices. And those markets where there's constraint, either urban growth boundaries or restrictions on the supply of land or taxes on the supply of land, which is the Sydney story, we have all of those dynamics at play there. That's where you arrive at a dynamic. We've got a new house and land package at $1.5 million, which means if you can buy an established house for less than that being the perfect substitute, it's going to be a constrained supply market for quite some time.
So, and Tim, there was a report that was done by CIE in 2019 concluded that half of the costs of new house and land packages in Sydney is added by government taxes, fees, and charges. And then to quote the Labor Premier of South Australia, who I think is an excellent centralist politician, and I give him full credit for what he's doing in South Australia in terms of he's focused on the economy. What did he say? Where the capital goes, the homes go, the people go, and the jobs flow.
Yes.
I mean, it's not really that hard, is it, Tim? Tell me it's not that hard.
It is a very simple logic, but they have gotten, because there isn't someone defending that first home buyer moving into a new residential lot, they don't exist until they've purchased the home. And so there has been a perfect market failure there, that local councils aren't rewarded for development. In fact, if they permit one development, all of their existing voters may be opposed to it, and there is only one household that would be supporting it. We do have a dynamic there that's been very unhealthy. But yes, South Australia is a very good model to be looking at. House and land package, it was $650 12 months ago. It's a little bit higher than that now, but yes, 50% of cost of a house is taxes, fees, and charges. We're going to update that assessment before the end of the year. I'm not sure that the numbers are going to be substantially different, but when you look at, it takes 4 years to turn a dairy farm in South Australia to residential land, and 10 to 15 years to turn a dairy farm in Western Sydney to residential land. That's the difference. Wow. That inbuilt cost, the cost of carry there, and then we go back to who pays to make water flow uphill. Because of the planning restrictions on land supply, the processes that land developers have to go through, there are very few businesses competing in that market now. You need very deep pockets to be able to buy the land and hold it for 20 years. You need expertise in planning, political knowledge and understanding. And to bring all of that dynamic, we have a small number of businesses nationally that are engaging in land supply. We no longer see that small farmer bringing 300 acres to market independently. There is just a small number of very large landholders managing that supply of land.
And that's obviously because the fact that I've got to pay it up front.
That's right. And at the moment we hit other unique problems, and they will very rightly say they can't find the labour to bring land to market at the moment. And the Western Sydney challenge there is, of course, the airport and other infrastructure projects, which is very worthwhile and necessary. And we do have that chicken and egg problem at the moment. Yeah. And that's going to take some time to resolve.
Tim, can we lift the hood a little bit on public benefit? Can you help our audience understand better why should that those costs, which I don't disagree, but why should those costs be shared amongst more people? How does someone get a public benefit from someone who's building in a new house? Can you unpack that a bit further, please?
Yeah, well, let's take this lovely term called inclusionary zoning, and I'm taking the extreme, and that is where those building new homes have to pay for 100% of the cost of providing public housing stock. And that's inequitable because only 200,000 households build a new home, and there is 11 million Australian households, therefore everybody should be bearing the cost. But likewise, when the provision of roads, parks, public infrastructure services that are available for all residents of a city, it's not equitable to impose those costs on just those that are residing in a new residential suburb. Building of transport infrastructure, roads, trains, the likes, that is services that are available to all residents within that area or not within that taxpayer region. And if you impose them, you create such a significant barrier that you will prevent that development and economic activity. Now, economic activity in itself isn't the end goal, but while we have 550,000 net overseas migration, the government haven't found the right balance there between stable and reliable migration growth and unconstraining restrictions on new home build. And that's how, at the moment, that that affordability problem is being exacerbated.
And what's a good example of what you just said before? I mean, at the end of the day, these greenfield areas where all this extra cost has been added on to the final sale price of the land, well, they're not gated communities. In other words, if I've bought in an estate 1.5 kilometres away, but this new estate's got this fancy new playground and all of these sort of new facilities, I can get in my car, take my family over there and have a barbecue on this brand new sort of parklands and wetlands or whatever's being developed there. And I haven't paid for it, but it sounds like all of those people in that new subdivision have actually covered the cost for me to go and enjoy that amenity. And
they have, and even more than that, they're also paying for the upgrade to your train station in your existing suburb, and they're paying for the maintenance of your train station in your existing suburb. So you are being subsidised by those residents moving into new residential suburbs.
It's ridiculous.
And it is the same story for apartments as well. It is different in its own way, but the concepts remain the same. At some stage, you have to pay to make water flow uphill. If you front load that and tax it, you will get less.
So again, for the benefit of our listeners to really understand this, Tim, if we were to go back to previous decades, what would that ideally look like for you? If you were being asked for the direct advice and they were going to take it, what would you propose?
Well, in an ideal world, 100% of that cost is paid for out of consolidated revenue. In a less idealistic environment, more realistic scenario is like what we have seen in South Australia and Western Australia. I was there last week, and they are two markets where journalists ask, what would you like from the government? And the answer is actually just leave the market alone for a moment. Your government's doing a great job. They've just got a little bit of time to flow through here. But when we look at particularly East Coast markets, yes, it is. All of our market distortions are caused by government intervention into the market. And whether it is restrictions on access to overseas labour or restrictions on land supply or the taxes or the fees, planning restrictions, building code, which came in this year, is going to add $20,000 to $25,000 the cost of a new home or a new apartment. All of those restrictions just continue to stack on top of each other. And then the taxes that you pay on top of those restrictions.
Tim, are you telling me that regulation and government interference in a market impacts economic activity and economic growth? Is that what you're telling me, Tim?
Yeah. It's not a news story. Yes.
I'm
keep saying it louder.
Sorry for that loaded question, but it's so important. I don't know how to explain it. And obviously our community, they've been listening to Bryce and I rant about this for years in terms of the unintended consequences. And now, to your point, the political narrative that's going on, somebody's got to be blamed. And, I need a slow thinking system to understand all the moving parts, and they're difficult. So I'm just going to give you a little catch cry. It's property investors. Property investors are making property prices too expensive, and they get too many tax concessions. And so if we just get rid of property investors, everything's going to return to normal. Well, unfortunately with that is you don't get those apartments for the new arrivals and the migrants to come into the country, which also helps to the value add of the economic activity and the jobs for everyone there. So it's really frustrating from, obviously someone who's active in this space as well, to see that the governments are listening some political parties are using this for political advantage in terms of, to your point, minimum standards, freezing rents, taking away the incentive to invest. They are clueless in regards to what that means in terms of if those investors don't spend their tens of billions of dollars to actually buy these things, you don't get any supply at all.
Yeah, and look, in political parties' defence, that responsibility does come back on us to construct those arguments. And that first order effect is very appealing to a voter. Yes, put a tax on short-term rental accommodation will increase long-term supply, without seeing the second order effects. And so it is our obligation to continue to communicate and educate. But what inevitably happens there, if there isn't resistance, if there isn't arguments put forward, that 50% of the house and land package is an example, then yes, they do all circle in behind the easy win. And that's because I think all political parties, and when you look at the demographics of Australia, the average age of a voter is falling very quickly at the moment. And their desire to appeal to particularly that sub-25 age category at the moment. All political parties are circling around that. I think that is it is our obligation to communicate to that cohort of voters in particular.
I agree.
Hey, Tim, do you have optimism that it can be changed, right? When you've got short-term political times in power and you've got populist voting sort of nets, do you because we're talking here, it sounds logical, right, that we need to return, but do you have optimism that we can actually affect change?
Yeah, absolutely. It does take a long time, and even if the government knows exactly what their plan is, solving the housing affordability problem is going to be at least a decade. They can't solve it in the next 5 years. 1.2 million homes over the course of the next 5 years won't resolve this underlying problem. We won't at that point get to a rental vacancy of between 3 and 5%. If we can get to that rate of build and sustain it for another 5 years, then that scenario can likely play out. Politically, yes, it takes time though. It is about ongoing education. We're going through a cycle at the moment with the Productivity Commission. We'll come out of the next federal election on a slightly different cycle. We again have a new minister, but those policies, I would add that for the decade prior to 2020, trying to convince people that the underlying problem was a lack of supply was a challenge. All sorts of spurious arguments. Now on this side, that argument has at least been clocked up. There are a few other spurious arguments that come up, have to continue to whack. You can't ever let them go. That is that 10% of homes are vacant, which is untrue. It's a misunderstanding of the data. The narrative that Ben's referred to there around it's investors that are a problem. We have to continue to whack those arguments every time they come up so that politicians know not to step into that field. An Airbnb one is, I quite enjoy the Airbnb. I've had it a couple of times on stage with ministers, and it's not my role to defend that particular market, but just the dynamic that people have of how supply and demand in housing operates. It is, the Reserve Bank put it very well, it is just the population divided by the average number of people per home. That is how supply and demand work. We have 11 million homes and 25 million people. To solve that imbalance, you need to improve that ratio.
And to your point, it's not necessarily just done through regulation and bottlenecks and all of the challenges that they're currently doing, which, from the political cycle looks like they're taking action. But what we do know, and so obviously your job and Tim, my job as the chair of BritPicker is to basically advocate for good policy and what actually attracts that investment. And I mean, you've got a chart which we'll bring up in the YouTube sort of story here. Number of investor loans for new homes, 3 months till May 2024. Look what Western Australia did. I mean, it is off the charts in terms of the annual change of new supply coming into that particular market. And what did they do? They made no changes to no grounds evictions. They understood that ultimately that would give them a competitive advantage, and tens of billions of dollars of investment is flowing in. The capital's flowing in, the homes are being built, the jobs and opportunities are being put there. Like it is ludicrous to me that we have to go through a cycle, a political cycle, where we have to make dumb decisions and then work out that our decisions are dumb and then come back off those dumb decisions and get the balance right in terms of what we need.
Yes, convincing politicians that you can't solve this problem with more tax is very difficult because it is the first thing they go to. But yes, you mentioned WA there. That attracted extraordinary volumes of interstate investment over the past 12 months. And November last year, I was in Perth and I said they'd see a 30% house price increase over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. They've achieved that in about 9 months. It's quite an extraordinary story of what's happened there. That it's very clear to anyone looking 12 months ago that WA just stacked up on a capital growth and a yield basis for an investment. That dynamic has cooled very quickly, I think, in the past month. That story around house prices in Melbourne being cheaper than the established house prices in Perth. And a little bit of truth to that. Melbourne's going through a cycle at the moment. Government introduced a new tax, creates market uncertainty. While that one doesn't change the supply and demand equation, it is creating market uncertainty in a time when all we need is market stability, and just seeing Melbourne come off a little bit. So longer term, we'll see that house price growth in Perth is unsustainable. It will slow, though. Quite possibly see a 6 to 9 month period where house prices are stable or fall a little bit. The problem Perth has is just that underlying belief in themselves. After a decade of post-mining boom where house prices fell, they haven't seen that cycle where house prices increase rapidly for a short period of time, then stable, maybe fall a little bit, and then increase rapidly again. And that's what they're going to see. They're still significantly cheaper than what the prices are in Brisbane. Brisbane, of course, is a comparable market in terms of size and resources sector. Yet average West Australian earns significantly more than the average person in southeast corner of Queensland. So it's not until we get Perth prices consistent with Brisbane prices that they will have reached the end of that cycle. But we can see now that increase in number of housing starts there are 50% higher now than what they were pre-pandemic in Western Australia, which is great. We're starting to see some completions, which is going to ease that acute rental shortage that they have. Even through that cycle, they're not getting back to a market that has an adequate supply of housing. And whether it is ongoing mining investment, and I'm not talking about new production mines, I'm just talking maintenance of the existing ones, or the AUKUS investment, which is going to involve a lot of housing sustained over a long period of time. Certainly, you can see the volume home builders in that market starting to shape up their businesses to service that market. But yeah, Perth is Perth's Zigs, the rest of the country's Ags. It's consistent in this market as well.
Running a surplus, competitive advantage when it comes to cost of energy. They've got a lot going for them over there in the West. It could be a golden era for them for a period of time.
Well, let's hope it's stable.
Yeah.
So they've burnt enough cycles out. I think everyone's had enough of that.
Yeah.
Hey, Tim, can you talk? We've talked to the fact that the Victorian government is treating property investors as the ATM for the state. But can you talk to the Greens movement right now, where they are heavily attacking the rights of the landlord to do what they need to do to recover their costs in terms of freezes and advocating for sort of not letting the property investor treat the property as their own? That's a risk and again, back to my question before about the optimism.
Yeah. Well, look, if the market was left to its own devices and governments didn't constrain the supply of housing, we would have rental vacancies at maybe close to 5%, at which point landlords need to demonstrate to tenants that they are good landlords, that they are providing a value with property with value and competitive rental price changes. But of course, when governments have constrained supply, caused the problem, and then they're trying to regulate what good investor activity is, that is definitely the worst of those two scenarios. And certainly there's plenty of markets where rental caps have come into place, and now we're talking about minimal rental standards. It is unfortunate that in environments such as this, rental vacancies well below 2%, that balance of power between landlords and tenants is enormously skewed, and that does not lead to good public policy outcomes. So the only solution to that is more homes, increase supply, and ensure that rental vacancy gets back above 3%.
And we opened the conversation earlier around you think that the Foreign Investment Review Board allowing people to come into the market for apartments. Can we pick up on that point? How do you see that playing a role to help the tenants get the more balance that you just spoke of?
Yeah. So foreign investors globally, and there's a small number of global banks that build a very large number of homes in every market, and we force them out of the Australian market. And as a consequence now, significant reduction in the volume of apartments commencing construction. But politicians play to a particular dynamic, and it's important to point out that foreign investors cannot buy established homes in Australia. They can only build new. They have been prohibited from buying established homes since 1976. So this argument that foreigners are buying our houses and forcing up house prices is just untrue. They have to seek individual approval from the Federal Treasurer through the Foreign Investment Review Board, and I think there were 1,300 homes purchased last year by foreigners, established homes purchases by foreigners out of 500,000 homes. So it's a very, very small volume. Not able now. That restriction on investors buying established homes exists for a very good reason. We do want housing is a necessity, and we don't want it to be an investment stop for the global share market. That's not desirable. But we definitely want foreign investors building new homes. And it is that constraint on foreigners building new homes that politicians play on that, and they certainly dog whistle to underlying racist attitudes within the community, suggesting that foreigners are taking homes away from Australians. And there can be some truth to that. And certainly overseas migration, international students, the stories there, there has certainly been a significant increase in demand as a consequence of that. As I mentioned before, went from 175,000 net overseas migration to 0, now to 550, and are likely to be sustained well above 350 for some years. But that's not what I'm referring to, and that's not the taxes that we're referring to are taxes on foreign banks, foreign superannuation funds. Those global investors that have probably never been to Australia certainly aren't visa holders because they're not individuals. They are global banks, global superannuation companies that we want to attract into our market to get those apartments over their 50, 80% critical sales that they need in order to get homes to them. And it is that acute shortage of investment of any form that is central to getting to that 1.2 million or achieving an adequate supply of housing stock.
So let's simplify that down really to something that our community can grasp really quickly. There might be an opportunity to build 500 apartments in a complex. And let's say those foreign investors want to own 50 or 80 or even, whatever that is. Let's call it 100. Mm-hmm. There's still 400 other properties that will come to market as part of that development. And if those 50 or 100 don't get built, the 500 don't get built. So that's that right. Money doesn't come in here, then ultimately it's a detractor in terms of the overall supply of stock in this country. So Tim, you did mention you thought that was the biggest own goal for both Queensland and New South Wales in terms of, those provisions that they put in there to tax the investor out of the foreign investor out of the market. Looking at the same sort of information and changes and legislation change that we've seen in Victoria, windfall taxes, reforms to the way in which properties are managed down here, and all of those additional costs. Do you feel like you talked about a net loss overall? They're thinking this is great, we're going to get some extra tax revenue, but they don't get that economic growth story of which they get a greater pie of which they can pull that tax revenue from. Is that a similar story that's happening also in Victoria?
Yes, Victoria is really only a couple of years behind Sydney in introducing all these taxes. And as you mentioned, they've probably gotten a little bit ahead in the past couple of years. You tax new residential land at a time when it's extraordinarily expensive and you want to increase supply. The value capture tax in economics is a very good theoretical tax. And if what you were doing was getting rid of other developer taxes and replacing with a more efficient tax, that would make sense. Yeah. But just adding another one on top of it and arguing that it's an efficient tax, that's not a good public policy act.
Hey, Tim, my final question for you is, what question haven't we asked you that you think would help with this debate in terms of helping change the narrative in the marketplace around what it takes for us to solve the problem? Have we covered it, with the water going uphill, or is there something else that we might have missed that needs to be part of this conversation?
So I think another one that's going to raise its head above the parapet over the course of the next couple of months is macro-prudential restrictions. And it's a very unsexy topic. It's hard to explain, but since the GFC, we have seen ASIC and APRA continually increase restrictions on banks lending, particularly to first home buyers. And as a consequence of that, they have an ever desire to get a lower and lower level of mortgage delinquency. And the closer we get to 0, the higher the price of those restrictions are on first home buyers, because first home buyers, of course, are inherently the riskiest borrower. Investors usually have other assets and other forms of incomes. Banks are able to lend to those people with deep pockets. And what we've seen is it is now very expensive for banks to lend to first home buyers. We see 5% mortgages have been forced out of the market. Increasingly, anyone with less than a 10% deposit is being forced out of the market. And it's significantly more expensive now for banks to lend to somebody who had a 10% deposit compared to what it was 20 years ago. And so that has compounded the equity problem, making it, whilst in a lot of senses it's easier to service a mortgage today than it was 20 years ago, it is much harder to get that mortgage in the first place. And we've arrived at a scenario where it's probably time that we needed to look at a Reserve Bank style governance arrangement for ASIC and APRA. We probably need an independent board, and to set them a goal of mortgage delinquencies being between 2 and 3%, not unlike what we do with the Reserve Bank, accepting that inevitably some households will find themselves suddenly unemployed and unable to service their mortgage. But that in itself is not what government's role is. Government shouldn't be stopping banks lending to people that may find themselves unemployed. Their role is to ensure that the financial services sector is stable and reliable. And we have an extraordinarily low level of mortgage delinquency. Even if a household does default, if they're on a rising housing market and they're able to sell on that market, and that we don't enter into that financial contagion environment that we saw in the United States. And 4% unemployment, 3% interest rate buffer applied to lending at the moment. It is the the UK removed that 3% buffer 2 years ago. It's still in place in Australia.
Yeah, Tim, I've been sort of arguing this point also around the Council of Financial Regulators, which consists of Treasury, APRA, and obviously the RBA, in respect to, we can understand that I think they believe it's inflationary. It's going to add to that sort of demand pool, and they don't necessarily want more investors in the market at the moment. But
that's a really important topic, because it's not inflationary. Just because somebody is going from renting a house to buying a house, that does not create demand for housing. Allowing someone to get a loan is not creating demand. It does not change the number of homes in the market, and it does not change the population. They're the two dynamics that determine supply and demand.
Tim, I'm so glad you raised that, because we've been advocating that all of the time. But that's ultimately what they're thinking, that it is inflationary more broadly. Now, whether that's wealth effect for property prices going higher, but the reality is that we need this supply, and it's ridiculous to think if you've got interest rates at sort of say 6.5%, you've got a 3% buffer rate, that they're doing servicing calculations at 9.5%. I promise you that 25% of the population would fail on their mortgage if interest rates went to that height. And so it's impossible for them to get there, because the economy would collapse not only into a recession, but into a significantly deeper recession, which would ultimately then require a stimulus opportunity where the cash rate would go lower. So that makes absolutely no sense to me at all, that we're not sort of moving the dial on that. So I will continue to advocate and put pressure there also, in terms of, you want this supply story. Like, you're telling everyone's on the same boat, saying it's a supply problem. It's a supply problem. But ultimately, we're seeing none of the government making the tough decisions that instigate serious reforms in areas that we need them, and to reduce those costs. My final question to you comes down to this story of necessity being the mother of invention. And so we've talked about all of these fixed costs that are flowing through. What are we seeing on the building side and the development side around potentially 3D printing or prefabbed homes? Are we going to see the cost of construction come down with the advent of, again, AI, robotics, and obviously these new inventions that we're currently seeing?
So just the course of the past 6 months, you probably would have seen a reduction in contract prices, and that's because build times have contracted back to what they were pre-pandemic. So builders are now able to offer or are more prepared to cut their contract prices than what they have been over the past couple of years. What we've also seen over the past 15 years is an increase in vertical integration, an increase in consolidation at the top end of the market. We've seen now 1 in 10 detached homes in Australia are built by a Japanese-owned business, so foreign investment is in there as well. So we're starting to see quite a different structure to the industry. There are still, of course, 25,000 small builders building half a dozen to 30 homes per year. But vertical integration within the industry is one step to improving overall productivity and cost of delivering to market. I don't think that we're going to see 3D printed homes for quite some time yet. I don't think modular homes are going to be successful in Australia for quite some time, and that's because the level of customization that the customer expects and the level of customization that's required for each local council. There was a global business that invested in prefabricated homes in South Australia. They closed in November of last year. And while there are a lot of reasons why that business wasn't successful, the very last one they cited to me was that they couldn't sell homes into Victoria because they would have to move the home off a truck from one truck to a different truck, because the trucking regulations were different in Victoria compared to South Australia, and it is very expensive to move a home off one truck onto another truck at Murray Bridge. You hear all those and go, that's Now, the reason you do see modular homes in other markets is because they have shorter build horizons. So in those countries where you only have 6 months on site, modular homes make a lot more sense to get homes to market very quickly. In fact, Queensland last week as well, and North Queensland, remote areas in North Queensland, modular homes are very popular as well for the same story. They only have 6 month wet season, or 3 to 6 month wet season. They only have 6 month building horizons. And so modular homes work well in those environments. But also because of the level of pent up demand and the expectation, if you can build a new home in Australia, if you can buy a block of land, you're sufficiently financially solvent that you would like to have a say in customization of your home. And that's really customer preference for customization is really the barrier to modular housing in Australia.
Tim, sorry, can I build off the back of that? From an investor's point of view, right? I mean, ultimately, I want most of my value to be in the land, right? So if I can find a way of building for, say, 30% cheaper than the current format of building, from an investor's point of view, that's straight to the bottom line. So do you see, and considering we've got, say, 30% of, sort of small mum and dad private rental accommodation providers running their small businesses, that would be a material thing that would make me reconsider, even in, brownfield areas, that I can potentially put something on the land that's going to last me 50 years or whatever, and it serves the purpose in terms of safe and quiet enjoyment. Do you see any sort of trends happening in that space?
No, because the cost of building on site is still lower than the cost of prefab and relocation.
Yep. Okay.
So what we have seen is prefabrication as opposed to modular, and by that I mean wall frames, tilt-ups, SIP, structurally insulated panels. There's a variety of different. There has been a significant change in the way homes are constructed over the past 15 years. Apartments too, with bathroom and kitchen pods that come prefabricated and installed into the unit. That dynamic of warehouse manufacturing and then installation on site will certainly continue to grow. But modular homes themselves, outside of all of the volume builders do have a modular home business, and they will deliver them to market. They're particularly common for granny flats or secondary dwellings, farmhouses, and there is a place in the market for them. But modular homes to replace your 4-bedroom, your 4+2, it's not on the near horizon.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Tim, thanks for your time today. It's been really fascinating to, we've had a lot of economists on this show, but it's interesting to get your perspective because you're actually interacting at the coalface with the people who are actually bringing these things out of the ground. So you bring that unique insight to our audience and our listeners. So, on behalf of everyone here on the Property Couch, we thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.
Thanks, Tim. Terrific.
There you go, Ben. What a fascinating chat. And I made the point at the end there, but it's for someone who's actually interpreting the data as an economist you'd expect them to do, but also talking to the people that are at the coalface for which the data is actually produced. It was actually a really nice combination to see his insights and to see his thought process.
Yeah, and I think if I can expand on, why does the HIA have a chief economist and why they're based in Canberra? Well, because it's trying to keep the politicians honest. Like ultimately there's some hope there that if they can actually take a listening ear to the experts who have the data, then we don't get dumb political decisions. Now, that's unfortunately the politics, and Tim gave us a little window into the politics around, the sort of younger vote and why the Greens are going after that. And that's what I've sort of been saying. It's very dangerous. It's politically savvy by the Greens to do that, but it's ultimately going to be potentially very, very dangerous. And that's why I call them a dangerous political party, because their views of the world and how everything is meant to be fixed is to basically stop everyone from doing anything, kill business off, and then use borrowed money and charge higher taxes. And no one really wants that type of outcome. And so to have the likes of Tim fighting the good fight, with governments in Canberra is helpful and informing the debate, but it's hard work. And sometimes we get dumb decisions of which we have to reverse out on. And here's another good example, Bryce. In the recent PIPA survey, we saw New South Wales going from the second best place for investment in last year's survey to this year's survey going to the second worst. And what's off on the back of? That's on the back of, obviously, the sentiment shift that's happened. And to that point, it's going to cost New South Wales tens of billions of dollars of investment into adding to the supply. And that's just going to make rental accommodation and vacancy rates so much more difficult to find. And it's just going to, again, balloon the political story there. And those politicians need to understand it, and they need to tell the correct narrative rather than sort of using, I suppose, short narratives around, we'll fix this by taxing the property investor or whatever it might be. Like, it's just dumb politics, and it's no good for the country's long-term economic viability, which ultimately is the long-term living standards of all of the citizens in this country. So it's frustrating, but Tim's fighting the good fight, and so we really, really appreciate Tim coming on and sharing those insights.
Yeah, great point, Ben. I've talked on this podcast before about how I've actually experienced what he talked about there back in 2004. Me and two colleagues of mine were trying to build 21 apartments on the Gold Coast, 3-level walk-up. The details in another podcast, but the point for this story is we were trying to get it in before the 30th of June. From memory, it was 2005, which meant that we would have been under the previous headworks regime. Yeah. Post 30 June 25, we would have been under the new headworks regime, which was increased headworks costs. And so what the council did is they were putting a line through all DA applications at that time, and then you had to go to the Land Environment Court to actually prove that you qualified under the previous ones. But as soon as we put the headwork charges in from the other side of that date, made it infeasible to us. But let's assume that we, and because I was first-time developer, bit green, all that sort of stuff. So imagine if we actually had to put those in and went ahead. Well, ultimately, it would have been a reality that in the feasibility, we would have sold them for a higher price just because we would have to pass them on. So
yep, there you go.
Experience that personally. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is around road trip for the YouTube folks. You'll be able to see this video here to demonstrate it. But I've got leather seats in the back of the Prado, Ben. So when we were going with the kids, I remember we had the caravan on the back, and the seats are just mayhem on the back with just their stuff and their food and stuff. So this one here is just getting an old fitted double sheet, Ben, putting it over, and then just getting some. It's got to be old because you've got to cut through the seatbelt holders to make sure that you can get them through. And then at the end, Ben, you can just wrap that up and send it away. So as we're in the shadows of people starting to plan their road trips for the end of the year, and for those of you that might have some leather seats in the back, check this out. Might be something that will work for you. And if you've got something else that you do on road travel as well, let us know as we prepare for the caravan season. Ben, what's making property news?
Well, Bryce, I'm more and more political these days, unfortunately, because of exactly the sort of challenges that. It's all of these challenges that we're seeing, bad decisions being made by government and the political manoeuvring that we're seeing going on. And so this time, I've always said I will always compliment good policy. So again, to the South Australian Premier, that is sensible in terms of what they're doing in South Australia to attract investment and to get that thing moving. They've done some dumb things as well, but that's good policy. We've on this podcast talked before about the shared equity in terms of government and individuals and getting, everyone into the property market. I love that product. I love that policy. I love the fact that it's helping first home buyers get into the market, supported by government, avoiding additional lenders' mortgage insurance costs.
I just helped my cousin. I just negotiated a property using that scheme and they wouldn't have got in without it.
Beautiful. And so when I see a political party, such as the Liberal Party, who I'm shouting out in terms of shocking decision, absolutely ridiculous decision. So when they don't support a good policy like that, the unintended consequences are we've now got the Greens having to negotiate with Labor on housing policy. And so that ultimately means that the Greens get to grandstand about rental freezes, about eliminating, sort of concessions to investors who are putting their hard-earned billions of dollars into the property market to create that supply. And so it really is a political stunt by the Liberals, and it doesn't wash with me, and hopefully it doesn't wash with the 2.3 million property investors out there. We love the idea that Australians can own their own home, and in the interim, or going through that stage, they rent a property, that we provide in the rental stock in the market, that's a good story. So yeah, I'm basically calling out the Liberal Party in terms of paying politics. I called out the Liberal leader recently as well, saying I won't vote for someone who's a populist politician and who continues to put policies out there that are not centralist and are not good for economic growth in this country. The more that we try and alienate and polarise parts of our community for political gain is when our democratic system starts to fail. And so, I'm really disappointed with the way in which they're playing politics at the moment, the same way I am with the Greens. So I'm just shouting it out.
Well said, Ben. There we go. Going into bat for the first home buyer like you do and shouting that out is a good thing. So well done. Hey, another thanks to Tim for joining us today on what was a very insightful chat, mate. Until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks.